I invited my son and his wife to Thanksgiving dinner. On the day, they sent a stranger to my door instead. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did. Maybe that's the worst part, knowing somewhere deep down that the people you love have already made their decision and choosing to believe otherwise anyway, because the alternative is too quiet to bear. Earl passed in April. Heart attack. 74 years old, strong as an oak his whole life. And then one Tuesday morning he was just gone. The doctor said it was fast. Peaceful, they told me, like that word was supposed to help. There is nothing peaceful about coming home to a house that still smells like the person you lost. There is nothing peaceful about reaching across the bed at 3 a.m. and finding only cool sheets. 43 years. That's how long Earl Hargrove and I were married. 43 years of morning coffee and evening news, of arguments about the thermostat and compromises about vacation destinations, of building something that wasn't glamorous or perfect, but was ours in every sense of the word. And then April came, and I became a woman who talks to an empty chair. By November, I had learned to function. That's the word for it. Function. I went to the grocery store. I paid the bills. I answered the phone when Barbara Whitfield called, because Babs has been my neighbor for 19 years, and she checks in every few days with the kind of reliability that good friends have, and most people take for granted. I watered Earl's tomato plants in the back garden until the first frost killed them, and then I stood in the kitchen window and watched the leaves come down and thought, well, that's that. But Thanksgiving was different. Thanksgiving had always been ours. When Nathan called 3 weeks before the holiday, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a coffee mug. I remember the exact moment because I almost dropped the mug when his name lit up the screen. He'd been calling less frequently since Earl passed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow tapering off, like a radio station you're driving away from. Still there, but harder to hear. "Mom, we'll be there," he said. "We promise. Serena and I are both looking forward to it." I wrote that sentence down in my mind like a piece of music I wanted to remember. Serena was Nathan's wife of 9 years. She was sharp, well-dressed, and efficient in the way that some people are efficient, the kind that gets things done but leaves you feeling slightly managed. She had never been unkind to me outright. She had also never once asked me about myself without the question feeling like a checkbox on a list. When she and Nathan visited, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone while I cooked, offering compliments at the right intervals. "It smells wonderful, Dorothy, and you really outdid yourself." Things that sound warm on the surface and feel oddly hollow underneath. But Nathan loved her, and Nathan was my son. So I set 3 places at the table. I spent 2 days cooking. Not reheating, not assembling, cooking. The kind that fills a house with something that feels almost like company. I made the turkey the way Earl's mother taught me 40 years ago. Stuffed with cornbread and celery and just enough sage to make the whole kitchen smell like every good Thanksgiving I'd ever known. I glazed it with butter and apple cider and checked it every 30 minutes like it might escape if I looked away. I made Nathan's mashed potatoes. He'd loved them since he was 7 years old. Cheddar cheese folded in at the end. No onion. Extra black pepper. I hadn't made them since the last time he'd sat at this table, which had been 14 months ago. And even then he'd eaten standing up because Serena wanted to get back on the road before dark. I made a cranberry sauce from scratch, the kind with orange zest that Earl used to eat straight from the serving bowl with a spoon when he thought I wasn't watching. I made green bean casserole. I made 2 pies, pumpkin and pecan, because I couldn't decide, and honestly, because making 2 felt like the kind of abundance that belongs to a real holiday. Earl had planted sugar pumpkins in the garden this past spring. He'd been excited about them, talked about them in that quiet, steady way he had, not boasting, just present. He never got to see them grow fully. I harvested them in September and kept 3 on the back porch. The pumpkin in that pie was from his garden. I don't know why that felt important, but it did. I pulled out the good china. It was only used at Thanksgiving and Christmas, cream-colored with a thin blue border, a wedding gift from Earl's Aunt Carolyn, who'd been dead for 20 years. I washed each piece by hand and set them out the night before so the table would be ready. 3 place settings, 3 wine glasses, the good linen napkins ironed. I put Earl's chair at the head of the table. I set a glass of water there. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because the alternative, an empty chair with nothing at all in front of it, felt like an announcement I wasn't ready to make. I got up early on Thanksgiving morning and put on the blue dress. The one Earl always said made me look like myself, whatever that meant. I used to tease him about it. "What does that even mean, Earl?" And he'd just smile and say, "It means you look like Dorothy." I hadn't worn it since his funeral. I took it off the hanger, held it for a minute, then put it on. I fixed my hair. I put on lipstick, the coral shade I've worn since 1987. I looked in the mirror and thought, okay. The house smelled like Thanksgiving. The November light was pale and clean through the kitchen windows. Nat King Cole was playing softly in the living room. I had set the table at 10 o'clock that morning, and by noon everything was ready. The turkey resting, the pies cooling on the counter, the rolls covered with a dish towel. For the first time since April, I felt something that was almost like anticipation. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more careful than that. The feeling of a door that might open. Dinner was at 2 o'clock. At 1:45, I sent Nathan a text, just a simple one. "Turkey's resting. See you soon." It delivered. I watched the screen for a moment. No response. That was fine. He was probably driving. At 2 o'clock, I sat down at the table. I didn't eat, just sat there with a glass of iced tea, listening to the sound of the house. The refrigerator hum. A car passing outside. Wind against the window glass. At 2:15, I got up and put the rolls back in the oven on low to keep them warm. At 2:30, I checked my phone. Delivered. Still no response. I told myself traffic on I-40 can be terrible on Thanksgiving. People underestimate the drive. At 2:45, I moved the turkey back to the oven on the lowest setting. I turned down the music. At 3 o'clock, I sat by the living room window. The street outside was quiet and gray. A neighbor's dog barked twice and then stopped. I watched a pair of sparrows land on the sidewalk, peck at something, and fly away. At 3:15, I sent another text. "Nathan, everything okay?" It delivered. It was red. I could see the small read notice beneath the message. He didn't respond. I set the phone face down on the end table. I looked at Earl's chair. I said out loud to no one, "He's probably just bad with his phone." Earl would have given me a look for that one. He always said I made excuses for Nathan the way some people make excuses for the weather, like if I just described it charitably enough, it would change. At 3:30, the food was cooling in earnest. I put the mashed potatoes in a covered dish and set it back on the warm stove. The cranberry sauce had already firmed up more than I'd wanted. At 3:45, the doorbell rang. I stood up so quickly that I knocked the throw pillow off the couch. I smoothed my dress, a reflex, something I've done my whole life before answering the door, and walked quickly to the entryway. My heart was doing something embarrassing in my chest. Relief, or something shaped like it. I opened the door. It wasn't Nathan. It was a young man I'd never seen before, maybe 22 years old, wearing a gray zip-up jacket with a delivery company logo on the chest. He was holding a cream-colored envelope and looking at his phone with one hand. "Delivery for Mrs. Dorothy Hargrove?" "Yes," I said. "That's me." He handed me the envelope without making eye contact and walked back down the porch steps before I'd even fully processed what had happened. No signature required. No explanation. Just the envelope placed in my hands, and then the sound of his car pulling away from the curb. I stood in the open doorway. The wind came through and I felt it on my arms through the thin sleeves of the blue dress. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written on the front in Serena's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. She wrote in that neat, controlled cursive that looks like it was practiced until all the personality was removed from it. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I stood in the entryway for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened the envelope. One sheet of paper, folded in thirds. Her handwriting again. "Dorothy, we're so sorry. We decided to spend Thanksgiving with my parents this year. It was a last-minute change, and we didn't want to make things awkward. We hope you understand. Serena and Nathan. No love, no phone call ahead of time. No, we'll make it up to you, or can we come next weekend? Just that." A note delivered by a stranger on a holiday. I read it a second time, then a third. I folded it carefully along the same creases and set it on the table in front of me. Then I stood up, walked to the stove, turned off the burners one by one, and began wrapping the food. Quietly, methodically. Plastic wrap over the mashed potatoes, foil over the turkey, lid on the cranberry sauce. Each one wrapped and labeled and stacked in the refrigerator with the kind of precision that happens when you need your hands to do something because your mind has gone somewhere you can't follow it yet. I left the pies on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to put them away. I turned off the music. I sat back down at the table. 3 place settings, 3 wine glasses, water in Earl's glass, still untouched, the good china, the ironed napkins, the 2 pies cooling in the quiet kitchen. I sat there for a long time. Later that evening, I opened Facebook. I don't use it much. Babs set up my account years ago, and I mostly scroll through it the way you might flip through a magazine at a doctor's office. But that night, something made me look. Patricia Goodwin, Serena's mother, had posted 3 photos. Her dining room in Charlotte. Long table, white tablecloth, candles lit, wine poured. A dozen people, easy, faces I didn't know. And there, near the far end of the table, Nathan, in a burgundy sweater I'd never seen before, laughing at something. Serena beside him, her hand on his arm, leaning in. The caption read, "So grateful for every face at this table. Blessed doesn't begin to cover it." I looked at the timestamp. The photos had been posted at 4:17 in the afternoon. 42 minutes after his text to me had been read and left unanswered. I didn't comment. I didn't react. I just looked at my son's face. That laugh I'd known for 44 years, first heard in a hospital room when he was 4 hours old, and understood something I had been not understanding for a very long time. They hadn't forgotten. There had been no last-minute change. This had been planned. The courier, the timed arrival of the envelope, the careful wording of Serena's note, all of it arranged so that by the time I knew, there was nothing to be done. I closed the app, set the phone on the counter. The kitchen was very still. The pies sat on the counter where I'd left them. The china was still on the table. Earl's water glass caught the overhead light and threw a small reflection on the wall. I thought about what Earl used to say, in that quiet, unhurried voice he had, when something was bothering me and I was trying to explain it away. "Dot, what does it look like if you stop explaining it?" I looked at the table. 3 settings. 1 note in an envelope. A son who read my message and said nothing. I stopped explaining it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room in the dark with the lamp on low, still in the blue dress, my shoes finally off. The house made the sounds old houses make. The settling, the hiss of heat through the vents, the branch against the back fence in the wind. Earl's chair was across from me. The wingback one near the bookcase that he'd had since before we were married, reupholstered twice, the armrests worn to a shine on the ends where his hands always rested. I used to complain that it was ugly. He used to say it was the most comfortable chair ever made by human hands, and that I was wrong about it. We had that argument for 30 years, and I never once meant it. I thought about Thanksgivings when Nathan was small, Earl carving the turkey with Nathan standing on a step stool beside him, watching with the specific intensity that small children have when they believe they are witnessing something important. Earl letting him hold the carving fork, guiding his hands. Nathan at 7, at 10, at 16. Each version of him layered over the others in my memory until they blur into something that feels less like a specific moment and more like a feeling. This is who we were. I thought about when Nathan brought Serena home for the first time. Thanksgiving, 7 years ago. I had cooked for 2 days, set the table the same way I always had, worn the blue dress. I'd asked her questions about herself and listened carefully to her answers and tried, really tried, to make her feel like she belonged there. She had been polite, appreciative. And there had been a moment, near the end of the evening, when she and Nathan exchanged a look across the table that I wasn't meant to see. A look that said we can go soon. I had told myself it was nerves. New relationship. First holiday. Everyone is awkward at first. And then every year after that, some version of the same story. They were going to her parents this year, or they had to get back early, or traffic, or Nathan had an early meeting Monday. The visits grew shorter. The calls grew less frequent. I kept setting the table. I reached over and picked up the folded note from where I'd left it on the end table. Read it one more time. And we didn't want to make things awkward. Not we're sorry we hurt you. Not we know this is your first Thanksgiving alone. Just we didn't want things to be awkward. For them. In Charlotte, at someone else's table. I set the note down. Earl, I thought. Did you know this was coming? The lamp hummed. The branch hit the fence. I looked at his chair, empty and worn and completely irreplaceable, and I waited for an answer I knew wasn't coming. I woke the next morning before 6. I'd fallen asleep in the armchair sometime after midnight, still in the blue dress, a blanket pulled over my lap. I don't remember doing that, so maybe the night had some mercy left in it after all. The lamp was still on. The house was the particular cold that old houses get before the heat kicks in. I pulled the blanket up and sat there for a minute, taking inventory of myself the way you do after a long illness. Am I all right? What exactly is broken, and what still works? I was sad. I was tired. I was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite name yet. Not anger, not quite. Something quieter and more purposeful, like a door closing rather than slamming. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard in the early light. Gray sky, bare trees, the last of the season's leaves plastered to the wet grass. Earl's garden bed stood empty along the back fence, the stakes still in the ground from his tomato plants. I'd never pulled them out. I wasn't sure I was ready to. He used to come out here every morning, 6 a.m., regardless of weather. I never understood it. The yard looked the same to me at 6 as it did at 8, but Earl said there was a quality to early morning light that you couldn't see if you waited. He said it was when you could think most clearly. I set my coffee mug on the windowsill and went to get my shoes. The cold hit me when I opened the back door. Clean and sharp. The kind of November cold that reminds you you're alive whether you want reminding or not. I walked the stone path along the garden beds, past the empty tomato stakes, past the old iron bench that needed a new coat of paint. The yard was quiet except for the wind, and somewhere in the maple tree near the back fence, a single bird trying to decide something. Earl had a small outbuilding at the back of the yard. Not a shed exactly, more of a workroom, 8 by 10, where he kept his fishing gear and woodworking tools, and increasingly in his later years, simply went to think. I hadn't been in it since he died. The door was unlocked. Earl never locked it. And I stood at the threshold for a moment before stepping inside. It smelled like him. Cedar and machine oil and something I couldn't name that was simply Earl. His fishing rods hung on the wall in order of size. His tackle box sat on the workbench, the large one he'd had since the 1980s. Green metal with brass latches worn smooth from handling. I don't know what made me walk to it. Some instinct, maybe. Some version of his voice in my ear saying, look. The tackle box sat exactly where it always had. But on top of it, held in place by a piece of masking tape, was a small manila envelope. My name on the front, Earl's handwriting, and in the lower left corner, a date, written in his hand, circled once. 9 months ago, 1 week before he died. I picked it up and held it in both hands, there in the cold workroom with the smell of cedar around me and the birds still deliberating in the maple tree outside. My hands were completely steady. I noticed that. I don't know why it surprised me. I took the envelope inside. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, still warm, and looked at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. There was no rushing this. Whatever Earl had left here, he had left carefully, and it deserved to be received the same way. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting, a little shakier than usual, the pen pressed harder in some places than others, like the words were being chosen and committed to at the same time. It said, Dot, if you're reading this, something happened that I hoped wouldn't. Go to the tackle box, bottom compartment. There's more. Don't call Nathan first. This is yours. That last line, don't call Nathan first. I set the paper down, looked at the door to the backyard, looked at my coffee. Then I got up, went back outside, and opened the tackle box. The bottom compartment held a Ziploc bag, sealed carefully, the kind Earl used for keeping his lures dry on rainy fishing trips. Inside, a second envelope, thicker than the first, and taped to the outside of the bag, a small brass key on a plain ring, old, worn smooth, but solid. I brought everything inside, sat back down at the table. Inside the thick envelope, a folded letter in Earl's handwriting, and beneath it, a printed document. Legal looking, my name at the top. I read the letter first. Dorothy Jean, if Nathan ever turns his back on you, what's in these papers is yours and yours alone. I've been keeping something ready for a while now. The address on that document is a place I want you to have. It's not much. But nobody can take it from you. Nobody even knows about it. The key opens the front door. I should have told you sooner, but I needed to be sure you'd need it before I worried you with it. That was probably not the right call. You can be annoyed with me about it. I love you more than you know, more than I ever said correctly. Earl. I read it twice. Then I unfolded the document beneath it. It was a property deed. My name on it. Just mine. An address in Maryville, Tennessee. 35 minutes from where I was sitting. I looked at the brass key in my palm. Smooth edges. Old but solid. Earl had held this key. He had taped it to that bag in that bottom compartment and carried whatever this was quietly, alone, while going about his ordinary life beside me. I thought about the morning he died, how he had asked me at breakfast whether I wanted the regular coffee or the dark roast, how I had said regular and he had said good choice, and that was the last conversation we ever had. He had known for at least 9 months before that morning that he might leave me alone in this house, and instead of telling me, or perhaps alongside telling me in ways I hadn't understood, he had been preparing. I held the deed and the key and the letter and sat very still in my kitchen. Outside, the bird in the maple tree finally made up its mind and flew away. Earl, I thought, what did you do? I left the next morning just after 7. I hadn't planned to go so soon. I told myself I would wait, think it through, maybe call Babs, maybe sit with the deed and the key for another day or two before doing anything about them. That's how I've always operated. Earl used to say I was the most deliberate person he'd ever known, that I thought about things from every angle before I moved, which he admired and also occasionally found maddening when he just wanted to go to dinner and I needed 20 minutes to consider the restaurant options. But I didn't wait. I was up before 6, dressed by 6:30, thermos of coffee in one hand and a peanut butter sandwich in a paper bag in the other, the way Earl always packed for short trips. Take more than you think you need, just in case. And I was in the car and backing out of the driveway before I had fully decided I was going. Sometimes the body knows before the mind does. The GPS said 37 minutes to the Maryville address. I drove south on the highway as the morning sky went from gray to pale gold, the kind of November light that's thin and cold but honest. The route took me past the Kroger where Earl and I had done our weekly shopping for 22 years, past the high school where Nathan had played basketball his junior year, past the exit for the state park where we had picnicked every 4th of July until Nathan left for college, and the tradition quietly dissolved without anyone officially ending it. All of it familiar. All of it his, in one way or another. I turned off the highway at the Maryville exit and followed a 2-lane road that curved through fields and low hills, past a feed store and a volunteer fire station and a white church with a hand-painted sign out front. All are welcome, especially the tired. I almost stopped to take a picture of that sign. Earl would have loved it. The GPS told me to turn onto a gravel road just past a small hardware store. The road had no sign, just 2 tire tracks through dry November grass, with oak trees on both sides that had held onto their brown leaves past their time. I slowed to barely 15 miles an hour, watching the numbers on the mailboxes, most of them faded and tilted. And then the road curved gently, and I saw it. A white farmhouse. 1 story, long and low, with dark blue shutters and a covered front porch that ran the full width of the house. A stone path from the gravel drive to the front steps. A maple tree in the front yard, bare now, but large. The kind of tree that takes 50 years to grow. It was not grand, it was not new, but it was cared for. The paint was clean. The porch boards looked solid. The walkway stones were set level, and the gaps between them were clear of weeds, which in November meant someone had tended them not very long ago. I parked in the gravel drive and sat in the car for a moment, engine off, just looking at it. Earl had been here. He had stood in this driveway, walked that stone path, sat on that porch. He had done all of that without telling me, carrying this place inside him the way he carried so many things. Quietly, completely, with full intention. I got out of the car. The cold hit me right away, sharper out here than in Knoxville, closer to the mountains. I pulled my coat tighter and walked up the stone path. The porch steps were solid under my feet, not a creak, which meant someone had replaced boards at some point, because all old porches creak eventually. I took the brass key from my coat pocket. My hand was steady again. I noticed it again, and again it surprised me. The key slid into the lock without resistance, as if the lock had been waiting for it, as if the fit was so precise it bordered on something other than coincidence. 1 turn, a clean click. The door opened. The air inside was warm, not heated. There was no hum of a furnace running. but the particular warmth of a closed space that has been maintained, insulated, looked after, not abandoned, kept. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. A small entryway, wood floors, dark and wide planked, the kind they don't mill anymore. A wooden bench along one wall with boots lined up beside it. 2 pairs, both Earl's, one his old fishing boots, and one the brown lace-ups he wore for yard work. His canvas jacket hung on the coat rack beside the door. I touched the sleeve of the jacket. It was the one he'd worn to the hardware store every Saturday for a decade. The collar was worn at the fold. One of the buttons had been replaced with one that didn't quite match. I had sewed it on one winter evening while he watched the news, and we'd argued about whether it matched enough, and he'd said it was a coat, not a costume, and I had laughed until I dropped the needle. I stood there with my hand on that sleeve for a long moment. Then I walked forward into the living room. I stopped in the doorway. Every piece of furniture was familiar. The floor lamp in this corner, I had donated that lamp to Goodwill in 2019 after Earl refinished the living room floor and said we needed something taller, except apparently he had not donated it to Goodwill. The oval braided rug under the coffee table. I had last seen that rug in our guest room, replaced 3 years ago when Nathan's old bedroom became my sewing room. The wingback chair by the window, not Earl's chair from the living room, but its twin. The matching one we'd bought together in 1993 and had reupholstered at the same time. The one I'd always assumed ended up in storage and then in a donation pile years later. He had been moving pieces here, quietly, over time. A lamp here, a rug there. Things I barely noticed leaving because they left gradually, one at a time, over years. On the mantel above the stone fireplace, 3 framed photographs. I walked closer. The first was our wedding photo, 1981, the one from the photographer, the formal one where we're both standing too straight and smiling too carefully. But Earl's eyes were looking at me instead of the camera, and I've always loved him for that. The second was Nathan at 5 years old, sitting on Earl's shoulders at the county fair, arms thrown wide, absolutely fearless. Earl had both hands on the boy's ankles, looking straight up at him with an expression I can only describe as pure. Before things got complicated. Before life put its weight on all of us. The third photograph I had never seen. Earl, sitting in the rocking chair on this very porch, viewed through the front window, the mountains visible in the distance behind him, a coffee cup in his hand, his face in profile, looking out at something beyond the frame. He looked, and this is the only word I have for it, at peace. Not resigned, not tired, genuinely at peace. Someone had taken that photograph. Someone had been here with him. I would find out later from Mr. Simmons that Earl had visited this property 11 times over the past 4 years. Always alone except for 2 occasions. One visit was with the contractor who made repairs. The other was on an afternoon in early March, a week before he died, with Mr. Simmons himself, to finalize the paperwork. Mr. Simmons said Earl had sat on that porch for half an hour and asked him to take a photograph. He said he wanted you to be able to see what it looked like when it was peaceful, Simmons told me later. He said you'd need to know that a place could be peaceful. I stood in front of that photograph for a long time. On the coffee table, a single folded note. White paper, his handwriting. I sat down on the sofa, our old sofa, the gray one from the den, which I had also apparently not donated to Goodwill, and opened it. 5 words. This is yours, Earl. 5 words. After 43 years, after everything we'd built and weathered and lost and held together with patience and stubbornness and genuine love, 5 words were enough, because they were exactly the right ones. I sat on that sofa in the quiet farmhouse with his note in my hands, and I looked around at the room he had assembled for me, piece by piece, trip by trip, without a word, and I felt something break open in my chest. Not break apart, break open. The way ground does in spring after a long freeze. Not destruction. Release. I pressed my hands over my face and I cried. Not the brief, managed crying I had been doing since April, the kind that you allow yourself for a few minutes and then stop, because there are dishes to wash and bills to pay and a life to maintain. This was the other kind. The kind that has been accumulating for 8 months without a proper place to go. The kind that once it starts, simply has to finish. I cried for Earl. I cried for the empty chair. I cried for 43 years of ordinary Tuesday mornings that I hadn't known were extraordinary until they were gone. I cried for the blue dress and the good china and the mashed potatoes with cheddar cheese that nobody ate. I cried because my son had read my message and said nothing, and because somewhere in Charlotte, his wife had written a careful note designed to be undeniable, and because none of it was a surprise. And the fact that it wasn't a surprise was its own grief entirely. And then slowly it stopped. I lowered my hands, took a long breath, looked around the room. The lamp was on. Earl had left it on a timer, I found out later, set to come on at 6 every morning and go off at 10 every night, as if the house should look lived in whether anyone was there or not. Through the front window, the bare maple tree stood against the pale sky. I thought, he did this for me. Not because he doubted me, not because he thought I was fragile, because he loved me with the kind of love that doesn't just feel things. It does things. It plans. It prepares. It says, I see what might happen, and I'm going to make sure you're standing when it does. I got up and walked to the kitchen. The pantry was stocked. Neatly, practically. Canned vegetables, dried pasta, rice, coffee, a jar of the same brand of peanut butter Earl had bought for 30 years. A grocery list was taped inside the cabinet door, written in his handwriting. Coffee, bread, eggs, butter, sugar. The staples. The things that mean someone is going to cook a real meal. The table in the corner was small. 2 chairs, 2 placemats, a small ceramic dish in the center that I recognized from our first apartment, the one I'd thought was lost in one of our moves. Nothing in this house was lost. It had just been waiting. I filled the kettle and put it on the stove and stood in that small kitchen while the water heated, looking out the window at the backyard. A wooden birdhouse on a post, a garden bed along the fence, dormant now but outlined in stones, river stones, the kind Earl used to collect whenever we were near water. He had been here in summer. He had built a garden here. The kettle whistled. I found chamomile tea in the cabinet, the kind I drink in the evenings, and made a cup and sat at the small table and looked out the window and just breathed. For the first time since April, I felt like I had somewhere to be. 3 days later, my phone rang just after 9 in the morning. I was in the kitchen in Knoxville, finishing breakfast, still thinking about the farmhouse. I had been back twice already, once to go through the bedroom closets, once simply to sit on the porch in the cold morning air and look at the mountains. Each time, the house felt more like something I had always known and simply hadn't found yet. The number on my screen was one I didn't recognize. A 865 area code, local, I answered. Mrs. Hargrove, my name is Albert Simmons. I was your husband's financial advisor for 12 years. His voice was unhurried, careful, the voice of someone who has learned to pace difficult information. Earl asked me to contact you if things changed at home. I have reason to believe they have. I sat down. You could say that. I think it's time we met in person, he said. There are some things Earl wanted you to know. He was very specific about the timing. He said not until you needed to hear them. I believe you need to hear them now. I looked at the brass key sitting on the kitchen counter, where I'd left it after my second visit to the farmhouse. Where and when? I said. He said. Albert Simmons had his office on the second floor of a brick building in Oak Ridge, above a bakery that made the whole stairwell smell like cinnamon rolls. The office itself was modest. Filing cabinets along 2 walls, a desk with a clean surface, framed photographs of the Appalachian Trail, and a small wooden sign that said in plain lettering, Steady Winds. Simmons himself was in his late 60s, trim, gray-haired, glasses with simple frames. When he shook my hand, he used both of his, the kind of handshake that means something. I want to say first, he said, once we were seated, that your husband was one of the most quietly prepared people I've worked with in 40 years. Not because he was fearful, because he was paying attention. He opened a slim black folder on the desk between us. Earl's finances were mostly straightforward. Joint accounts, retirement savings, the Knoxville property. But 5 years ago, he came to me and asked to move a portion of his retirement savings into a separate trust. Private, in your name only, not listed on any joint documentation. He turned the folder toward me. At the top of the page, my name, Dorothy Jean Hargrove, and below it, a number, $580,000. I looked at it. Read it again to make sure I was reading it correctly. Nathan doesn't know this exists, Simmons said. Earl was very deliberate about that. He called it the rainy day account. He said, Simmons glanced at a note card in the folder, reading carefully, if she ever needs an umbrella, I want to make sure she's already got one. I pressed my lips together. That was Earl. Completely, entirely Earl. He also asked me to keep a record, Simmons continued, of certain financial interactions with Nathan over the years. For your protection, he said, so that if questions arose, you would have the full picture. He turned to a second page. In 2015, Nathan asked Earl for $30,000 to open a retail business. Earl gave it to him as a gift, no repayment expected. The business closed within 14 months. Nathan never mentioned it again. I remembered that. Earl had come home one evening and told me he'd help Nathan get started on something. I hadn't known the amount. I hadn't asked. That was how it worked with Earl and money. He handled it, and I trusted him too. In 2018, Nathan requested $90,000 for a real estate investment. Earl declined. Nathan did not speak to him for 6 weeks following that conversation. That I had not known. 6 weeks. I thought back to 2018. Nathan had been distant that fall, and when I'd asked Earl about it, he'd said Nathan was busy with work. I had believed him because I wanted to. In 2021, Simmons said, and here his voice shifted slightly, careful in a new way. Serena called Earl directly. She said she wanted to discuss family financial planning and asked to be added to a power of attorney for your joint accounts. Earl declined, recorded the call with her knowledge, and brought the recording to me. I looked at him. Serena called him, not Nathan. Nathan was on the call as well, but Serena did the talking. I sat with that for a moment. There's one more thing, Simmons said. He reached for a third page and set it on the desk facing me. This is a photocopy of a check drawn from your joint account in March of 2020, $18,000. The memo line says home renovation. I looked at the check, my name on the signature line, Dorothy J. Hargrove, in careful cursive. That's not my signature, I said. Not a question. I knew it the moment I saw it. The D in Dorothy. I closed mine at the top with a small loop. This one was open. The H in Hargrove. Mine angles left. This one was straight. No, Simmons said quietly. It isn't. Who deposited it? A contractor in Nashville. The work that was invoiced was on a rental property in Williamson County, Tennessee, owned by an LLC. He paused. The LLC is registered to Serena. The kitchen, the chamomile tea at the small table, the drive down the gravel road to the White House with blue shutters. All of it suddenly rearranged itself in my understanding, fitting together in a shape I had not wanted to see and could not unsee now. Earl found this? He found it in June of 2020. He confronted Nathan. Nathan said it must have been an administrative error, that Serena sometimes signed documents on their behalf, and perhaps there had been a miscommunication. Simmons looked at me steadily. Earl kept the check copy. He had a handwriting analyst look at it. He never brought formal charges. He told me he didn't want to destroy the family. His word. But from that point on, he began separating the assets. I was quiet for a moment. The bakery smell drifted up through the floorboards. Cinnamon, yeast, warmth. He never told me, I said. He said you would have gone to Nathan immediately, that you would have tried to fix it. He was right, completely right. That is exactly what I would have done. I would have called Nathan, and I would have given them the chance to explain, and I would have spent the next 2 years reassuring myself that it was a mistake, and that family was complicated, and that the important thing was to keep the door open. Earl had loved me enough to protect me from my own instinct to forgive too quickly. There's also this, Simmons said, and he reached into the folder one last time and produced a small printed sheet. Earl established something else about 2 years ago. He said it was still small, a seed, he called it, but he wanted it named, and he wanted you to know about it when the time came. He set the paper in front of me. At the top, in plain type, the Earl and Dorothy Hargrove Foundation for Women Who Stayed. Beneath it, in Earl's handwriting, a single line of description: for widows, caretakers, and women who gave their whole lives to others, and one day found the table empty. I could not speak. He left an initial sum, Simmons said gently, and instructions for how to grow it. He said you'd know what to do with it. His exact words were, "Dorothy will understand this better than I do. She always has." I sat in that office above the Cinnamon Roll Bakery for a long time. Simmons didn't rush me. He refilled my coffee from a carafe on the corner table and went quiet, which was exactly the right thing to do. Earl had not just loved me. He had seen me. He had watched, for years, the slow erosion of something he couldn't stop with words or arguments or confrontations. And so he had done what Earl always did when facing something he couldn't control directly. He had built a structure around it. He had quietly, patiently, over years, constructed a life I could stand in after he was gone. This is yours, Earl. I drove home in the blue afternoon light and turned into my driveway to find a car parked across the street. Nathan's car, engine running. He was on the porch before I had my door fully open, hands in his jacket pockets, face arranged into something careful. Serena was in the passenger seat. She didn't look up from her phone when I got out of my car. "Mom?" His voice was measured. "I think we need to talk." I walked up to the porch, looked at him. He looked like Earl around the eyes. He always had. And for a moment that almost undid me. Almost. "Okay," I said. I know Thanksgiving was— Look, I know. I should have called ahead. That was wrong." He rubbed the back of his neck. "But I wanted to come by because I was going through some of Dad's files in the garage, just trying to help organize, and there was some financial stuff that looked complicated. I thought maybe you could use some help sorting through things." I looked at him for a long moment. Steady. Quiet. "What made you think I needed help, Nathan?" "You've been through a lot. We worry about you. You haven't called in 4 weeks." He looked down. "I know. Things have been busy. Serena's been trying to get her business. The rental property in Nashville, or the one in Williamson County." The silence that followed was a very specific kind of silence. I watched it move across his face. First surprise, then something that tried to look like confusion, then something that gave up and was simply still. "I know about the check, Nathan," I said. "I know about the trust meetings. I know about the call in 2021. I know about all 3 times you asked your father for money. And I know what he found when he looked into where some of it had gone." "Mom, did you know she signed my name?" He looked away, to the left, toward the street, toward the car where Serena sat with her phone. That was my answer. "You didn't come here to check on me," I said. "You came to find out what I know. And now you know that I know." His jaw tightened. "I came because I'm worried about you. You're alone, you've had a hard year, and someone should be—" "Your father made sure someone would be," I said. "He made sure before he left." Nathan looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes that I recognized. The same expression he'd had at 8 years old when Earl caught him in a lie about where he'd been after school. Not guilt exactly. More like the recognition that the story he'd planned to tell wasn't going to work. "Go home, Nathan," I said. "Tell Serena I said hello." He stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked down the porch steps without another word. I watched him get into the car. I watched Serena say something, watched him shake his head. I watched the car back out of the driveway slowly, pause at the end of the street for just a moment, then pull away. I went inside, locked the door, put the kettle on. 2 mornings after that, Barbara Whitfield knocked on my door at 8 a.m. with a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a dish towel and an expression on her face that I had learned, over 19 years of neighborly friendship, to take seriously. Babs had been widowed for 7 years. She was sharp, plain-spoken, and constitutionally incapable of softening news she thought you needed to hear. I valued that about her more than I could say. "Sit down, Dot," she said, setting the cornbread on the counter. I sat. I heard something from Patricia Dawson. You know her. She does the flowers at First Baptist, whose cousin works in the clerk's office at the county courthouse. Babs pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "Serena has been talking to someone about a conservatorship." I looked at her. "A legal conservatorship," she said. "The kind where a family member can petition the court to take over someone's financial decisions and personal affairs on the grounds that the person is no longer capable of managing them independently." The cinnamon from Simmons's office, the weight of the folder on the desk, Earl's 5 words on that note card. "What grounds is she using?" I asked. My voice was level. I was surprised by how level it was. "That you've been isolated since Earl passed, that you've shown signs of confusion. Patricia said the specific example being passed around is that you left your stove on once this fall." Babs looked at me. Did you? I turned a burner on to heat soup, went out to check the mail, and came back inside 4 minutes later. I know. That's not confusion. That's Tuesday. Babs put her hands flat on the table. The point is she's collecting things, small things, building a picture. I thought about the farmhouse, the private trust, the deed with my name only, all of it out of reach, unknown, protected. I thought about what Earl had done and why he had done it, and I felt something settle in me like a foundation taking weight. Then we need to give her an answer, I said, before she finishes building the question. Babs looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, got up, and went to get her laptop from her car. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table Nathan had not sat at in 14 months. With cornbread and strong coffee and a binder Babs had apparently brought anticipating exactly this kind of afternoon. We drafted a formal letter, a declaration of sound mind and full legal competency, a notice of retained counsel through Albert Simmons, and a clear statement that any attempt to initiate conservatorship proceedings would be opposed completely and immediately under Tennessee law. I attached a copy of the handwriting analysis of the forged check. At the bottom of the letter, I added one line in my own handwriting. I am not confused. I am not fragile. I am simply finished pretending that silence is the same as acceptance. We sent it certified mail to both Nathan and Serena's address. Babs leaned back and folded her arms. There, she said. I looked at the letter in the outgoing tray. Earl would say I should have done this 2 years ago, I said. Earl, said Babs, was not the one who had to live with the hope that it might get better. I looked at her. You gave it every chance it deserved, she said. Now you're done. That's not failure. That's just the end of something that wasn't working. I nodded. Something in my chest, a thing that had been clenched tight since April, maybe longer, maybe much longer, loosened by 1 degree. Outside, the November sky had gone low and gray. Through the kitchen window, I could see Earl's empty garden beds along the back fence, the tomato stakes still standing in the ground. I thought, I'll plant something different in the spring, something just for me, something that blooms. 1 week after we sent the letter, Mr. Simmons came to my door. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past 2 o'clock. I was in the living room folding laundry, something I had started doing in front of the television because the silence of doing it in the bedroom had become too much, when I heard the knock. Measured, unhurried. Not Nathan's knock, which had always been 3 quick raps like he was in a hurry even to announce himself. I looked through the side window before opening. Albert Simmons stood on the porch in his wool overcoat, holding a small cardboard box with both hands. The careful way you hold something that matters. I opened the door. You didn't call ahead, I said. I didn't want to, he said simply. He lifted the box slightly. This needed to be handed over in person. I stepped aside and he came in, setting the box on the kitchen table with the kind of deliberateness that made me stop and really look at it. It was the size of a shoebox. Brown cardboard, taped neatly on all sides. My name on the top in Earl's handwriting. The same slightly uneven letters I'd been finding on envelopes and notes for the past 2 weeks, each one like hearing his voice from a room away. He gave me this 18 months ago, Simmons said. He was standing with his hands clasped, giving me space. He was very specific. He said, Don't give it to her until you're sure she's ready. You'll know when that is. He paused. You're ready, he said. I nodded. I believed him. He didn't stay long. He accepted a cup of coffee, asked if I needed anything, reminded me that his office was available whenever I had questions about the trust or the foundation paperwork. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame. He talked about you often, he said. In our meetings. Mostly about the foundation, what he wanted it to become. But sometimes just about you, the way you ran the household, the way you handled things. He looked at me steadily. He was proud of you in a way that men of his generation aren't always good at saying directly. No, I agreed. He wasn't good at saying it directly. He was very good at showing it, Simmons said. I closed the door after him and stood in the entryway for a moment. The house was quiet. The box sat on the kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, the way November light does when the sun is already thinking about setting by 3 o'clock. I made a cup of tea, sat down, and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, was a journal. Leather cover, dark brown, The kind Earl bought from the stationery shop on Market Street, the one that had closed 4 years ago, which had genuinely saddened him because he'd been buying his notebooks there since 1987. This one was worn at the corners, the spine creased from repeated opening. He had used it for a long time. I set the wrapping paper aside and held the journal in both hands. On the inside front cover, in his handwriting, "If you're reading this, it means I ran out of time to say all of this out loud. So here it is, all of it. No more holding back." I turned to the first page. He had dated every entry. The first was from 22 months before he died. The early entries were simple, observations mostly, the weather, things growing in the garden, a movie we'd watched together that he'd liked more than he let on at the time. The writing was steady and unhurried, the way Earl moved through most things. But by the 5th entry, something shifted. He wrote about watching me at the kitchen table after Nathan and Serena's last visit, the one where they'd arrived 90 minutes late and left before dessert. He wrote about how I had smiled through the whole evening, kept refilling glasses, kept the conversation moving, kept everything smooth. And then after they left, I had stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes with my back to the room, very quietly, for a long time. "She thought I was watching the news," he wrote. "I wasn't. I was watching her. She doesn't know how much I watch her." He wrote about a quality he called my capable sadness, the way I absorbed difficult things and immediately started managing them, rerouting the pain into productivity, turning heartbreak into dishwashing and worry into casseroles. He said he had admired it for 40 years and also that it scared him because it meant I was very good at not asking for help. "Dorothy could be drowning," he wrote, "and she would find a way to make it look like she was just doing the backstroke." I had to put the journal down for a moment, pressed my hand flat on the table, breathed. I picked it up again. He wrote about Nathan with a kind of careful love, never dismissing it, never pretending it wasn't real. Nathan was his son, and Earl's love for him was as plain as anything in those pages. But running alongside it, documented over years with the patient precision of a man who kept records of everything, was a different story. "The boy I raised would not have let his mother sit alone on Thanksgiving," he wrote. "The man he's become has learned to let Serena make the decisions about where they spend their time and energy, and Serena has decided that Dorothy is optional. I don't know if Nathan knows that's what's happening. I don't know which is worse, that he knows or that he doesn't." He wrote about the forged check. He wrote about his anger, real, specific, the restrained fury of a man who had spent a lifetime building something and watched someone try to quietly dismantle it. He wrote about the conversation with Nathan afterward, Nathan's careful deflections, Serena's polished denials. "I wanted to confront them properly," he wrote, "drag it into the light. But what would that accomplish? Dorothy would try to fix it. She would apologize for my anger. She would spend the next 2 years trying to rebuild something that the other party has no intention of rebuilding. I know her. I love her for it, and I can't let it be used against her." He wrote about building the trust, about finding the property in Maryville, about moving things there slowly over months. He wrote about sitting on that porch on an afternoon in early March, 1 week before he died, drinking coffee and looking at the mountains, thinking that the place was ready. "I don't know if I'll be the one to show it to her," he wrote that day. "I don't know how much time I have. I've known for a while that my heart is doing something it shouldn't. I haven't told Dorothy because she would turn herself inside out worrying, and I need her to have these last months without that weight. Maybe I'm wrong to keep it from her, but I'd rather she remember the mornings as normal, the coffee, the routine, the ordinary life." I closed my eyes. The kettle was cold on the stove. The afternoon had gone fully gray outside. He had known. He had known, and he had gone to the hardware store and asked me what kind of coffee I wanted, and said good choice, and let the morning be ordinary so I could keep it. I opened my eyes and kept reading. Toward the middle of the journal, he wrote something that I had to read 3 times before I could keep going. If she ever finds herself sitting at that table alone in the blue dress, waiting for someone who made her a promise they never intended to keep, I want her to know that I saw it coming. I saw all of it, and it has nothing to do with her worth. It has everything to do with their choices. He had written that 14 months before that Thanksgiving. He had known about the blue dress. The handwriting changed as the journal went on, more slowly formed, some letters larger than usual, the signs of someone writing through fatigue, but never sloppy, Earl was never sloppy. Near the end, he wrote about the foundation. "I want it to be real," he wrote. "Not just a name on a document. I want it to be something Dorothy can hold on to. Something that reminds her she's not just the person things happen to. She is the person who survived them and kept her dignity and made a home for everyone around her, even when no one was making one for her." He had left a list of ideas, organizations to contact, women's shelters, grief support networks, community centers that served elderly women living alone. A note that said, "Babs Whitfield would be a good person to help get this started. She knows everyone and she doesn't waste words." I laughed out loud at that. A single, sudden laugh in the quiet kitchen, the kind that surprises you. Earl had always liked Babs. He said she was the most efficient person he'd ever met, and that if she'd been in charge of the Apollo program, they'd have made it to the moon on a Tuesday and been home for dinner. The very last entry was written in large, slow letters. The date was 5 days before he died. He must have written it late at night, sitting at his desk in the study, the lamp on, the house quiet. "I don't have anything left to arrange," he wrote. "I've done what I can do. The rest is up to her. And I have never in 43 years doubted what Dorothy Hargrove is capable of when she decides to stop waiting for permission. She'll be all right, not right away, but all the way through. That's Dorothy. She doesn't do things halfway. I love her the way I love the mountains. I don't know how to explain it better than that. Just completely, and without any interest in changing them." I sat at that kitchen table in the fading afternoon light, with the journal closed in my lap and my hands folded on top of it, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not sadness, not entirely. Something larger than that, and stranger, and better. 43 years. All those ordinary Tuesdays, all those mornings with the wrong brand of coffee and the right brand of argument, all the ways we had driven each other to the edge of impatience and pulled each other back. All that time, this man had been watching me the way you watch something you intend to take care of for the rest of your life. I had known he loved me. I had not known the full dimensions of it. I set the journal on the table beside my cold cup of tea and picked up a notepad from the counter, the one I used for grocery lists, the ordinary kind, and I turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "For me," and beneath it I began to write. Not tasks, not obligations, not things to fix or manage or smooth over. Things I wanted, for myself, because I wanted them. Take a day trip to Gatlinburg in the spring, just to walk around. Paint the back bedroom at the Maryville house yellow, the color I always wanted and Earl said would be too bright. Start a flower garden. Not vegetables, just flowers. Call Babs about the foundation. Start small. Start soon. Write Earl a letter. Tell him what I found. I stared at that last one for a moment. Then I picked up the pen and added, "Tell him it was enough. More than enough. Tell him it was everything." 2 weeks before the following Thanksgiving, I sent invitations. Not formal ones, just index cards from the craft store, printed with a small autumn leaf border, handwritten in my clearest script. I drove around and delivered most of them personally, rather than mailing them, because some things deserve to be handed over in person. I gave one to Barbara Whitfield on a Tuesday morning while she was raking her front yard. She read it, looked up, and said, "I'll bring the cornbread and the cranberry sauce, and don't argue with me about the cranberry sauce." I gave one to Pastor James Elliott after the Sunday service at First Baptist, where I had started attending again for the first time in 2 years. Not from obligation, but because I needed somewhere to be on Sunday mornings that wasn't inside my own 4 walls. He was a quiet, practical man in his early 60s who had lost his wife 4 years ago and rebuilt himself with the kind of patient dignity that I recognized and respected. He read the card, said, "We'd be honored, Dorothy," and folded it carefully into his coat pocket. I gave one to Ruth Patton, who had been coming to the grief support group at the church since June. Her husband of 38 years had died in the spring, and she had an adult daughter in Denver who called every Sunday but could not get home for the holiday. Ruth took the card with both hands and read it twice and said very quietly, "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I told her. I knocked on the door of my new neighbor's house at the end of the street. A couple named the Prestons who had moved in over the summer. Both nurses, working opposite shifts, raising their 8-year-old son Cooper mostly on logistics and love and very little sleep. I had seen Cooper playing alone in the yard on Saturday afternoons with the specific self-contained energy of a child who is fine, but would be finer with company. I left the invitation with his mother, who looked at it and then looked at me and said, "He's going to talk your ear off about his Lego sets." "Good," I said. I could use the conversation. I gave the last invitation to Margaret Hollis, who ran the quilting circle at the senior center and had called me twice after Earl passed to check in, and whom I had not called back either time. I had been ashamed of that. I told her so when I handed her the card. She waved it off in the brisk, generous way of a woman who has been through enough to know that grief makes people go quiet, and it's not personal. "I'll be there," she said, "and I'll bring Margaret's famous sweet potato casserole." "Is it actually famous?" I asked. "It's famous among people who've had it," she said, "which is everyone I've ever fed it to. I cooked for 2 days, the same menu as the year before, almost exactly. The same turkey, the same cornbread stuffing, the same mashed potatoes with cheddar and black pepper, the pumpkin pie, the pecan pie, the cranberry sauce with orange zest. The house filled up with the same smell that had filled it the year before, when I had cooked it all for people who had no intention of coming. But this time, the cooking felt different. There was no anxiety underneath it, no calculating whether things would be good enough, warm enough, familiar enough to make someone choose to stay. I was not auditioning for anything. I was just cooking because I like to cook, because the smell of cornbread stuffing in a warm kitchen is one of the best things I know, and because there were people coming who were going to eat it. I put on Nat King Cole again. This time I sang along. I hadn't sung along to anything since Earl died. Babs arrived at 10 in the morning with cornbread in a cast-iron skillet and her laptop and an attitude that suggested she intended to be fully involved in whatever needed doing. She found an apron in the drawer where I keep aprons, put it on without asking, and started on the cranberry sauce. We worked in the kitchen together for 2 hours and talked about things I hadn't talked about since April. Not grief, not the situation with Nathan, not legal documents or forged checks. Just ordinary things. A book she was reading. The new family that had moved into the house on the corner. Whether the Maryville farmhouse had good soil for a spring vegetable garden. "I'm doing flowers," I said. "Not vegetables, just flowers." She looked at me. "Earl would have argued for tomatoes." "Earl's not here," I said, "so it's going to be zinnias and black-eyed Susans and whatever else I feel like." Babs smiled. "Good for you, Dot." By 2 o'clock the table was full. Not the way I had arranged the table the year before. 3 precise settings on the good china, everything symmetrical and formal and carefully calculated to impress. This table had 9 people around it, with a leaf put in to extend it, and a card table set up at one end for Cooper, who had declared within 3 minutes of arriving that card tables were actually better than regular tables because you could put your elbows on them without anyone caring. He had brought his Lego set. It was currently on the floor of the living room, partially assembled, abandoned in favor of the more compelling business of Thanksgiving dinner. The dishes didn't all match. The napkins were 3 different colors because I didn't have 9 of the same kind. Margaret's sweet potato casserole sat beside Bab's cranberry sauce beside Pastor Elliot's wife Sharon's green bean dish, which she had made from a recipe that had been in her family since her grandmother's time in Alabama. Ruth Patton had brought rolls from the bakery on Market Street because, as she said, "I tried to bake once, and I think it's better for everyone if I just support local business." It was not a perfect table. It was a full one. I sat at the head of the table, Earl's chair. I had thought about this moment many times in the days before Thanksgiving. Whether I could sit there. Whether it would feel like an intrusion or an erasure. Whether I was ready. I sat down, and it felt like neither of those things. It felt like taking my place. Cooper, from his card table, looked up at the empty chair to my left, the one I had set with a glass of water again, just as I had the year before. "Mrs. Hargrove, who's that one for?" The table quieted slightly. I looked at the chair. "That's for someone who made all of this possible," I said. Cooper considered this with the serious face of an 8-year-old who has decided the information deserves consideration. "Like a guardian angel?" he said. "Something like that," I said. He was more of a planner, but yes. Cooper nodded as if that settled it and reached for a roll. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter where I'd left it. I didn't get up. I heard the notification and stayed where I was, listening to Margaret explain the precise origin of the sweet potato casserole recipe. which involved her grandmother, a church competition in 1964, and a rivalry that apparently still carried heat 60 years later. After dessert, after Cooper had eaten 2 pieces of pie and constructed 12 inches of Lego on my living room floor, after the dishes were done and the coffee was made, and people had moved to the living room in the slow, contented way of people who are in no hurry to leave, I picked up my phone. One message. Nathan. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. Hope you're doing well. 9 words, sent at 4:17 in the afternoon. No apology, no acknowledgement of the letter we'd sent or the meeting with Simmons or the night on the porch steps when I'd told him I knew about the check. No mention of Serena. No question about how I was spending the day or whether I had anyone with me. Just 9 words, sent at a time carefully calculated to discharge an obligation. I read it twice. From the living room, I heard Babs laughing at something Margaret had said. A real laugh, the kind that bounces off walls. I heard Cooper ask Pastor Elliot if he knew how to build a Lego suspension bridge, and Elliot say, with complete seriousness, that he believed he could figure it out if Cooper was willing to consult. I heard Ruth Patton saying something quietly to Sharon Elliott, and Sharon saying, I know, me too, in the tone of one woman recognizing something true in another. I typed back, Thank you, Nathan. 4 words, honest, nothing more and nothing less than what I meant. I put the phone down and went back to the living room. Later, after the dishes were done and the leftovers were divided and sent home in containers, and Cooper had been retrieved by his grateful, exhausted mother, I slipped outside alone. The porch was cold. The November sky had cleared while we were inside, and the stars over Knoxville were sharp and bright. The kind of sky that only comes after a cold front pushes through and takes the clouds with it. I could see my breath. I pulled my cardigan tighter and sat down in the wooden rocking chair on the far end of the porch. I had not noticed that rocking chair before. It was old, the paint worn on the armrests, the joints solid. I looked at it more carefully in the porch light and recognized the shape of the legs, the particular curve of the back. It was the chair from our first house, the one from the bedroom we'd had before Nathan was born, before we bought the Knoxville house, when we were 28 years old and owned almost nothing, and it hadn't mattered because we had each other and enough sense to know that was sufficient. I had no memory of this chair leaving our possession, but here it was, on my porch, as if it had always been there. I sat down and rocked slowly. The chair had the same settled creak it had always had. Through the front window, warm yellow light. Babs was still inside, finishing her second cup of coffee and talking to Ruth, who I had noticed over the past 2 hours losing the careful, held-in posture of a woman trying to hold grief at a professional distance, and slowly, gradually, becoming someone who was just sitting in a warm house having a good evening. Pastor Elliot and Sharon had left 20 minutes ago, but not before he had quietly slipped a card from his pocket with the foundation's name written on it, a name he had apparently looked up on his own, and said, When you're ready to think about next steps, I know some people who would want to be involved. The street in front of my house was quiet. A dog walked by with its owner, both of them moving at the thoughtful pace of a late evening walk. 2 houses down, someone's porch light came on. I leaned back in the rocking chair and looked at the stars. Earl, I thought, you built a good table. Not the physical one, not the farmhouse, not the trust, not the foundation, though all of those were real and solid and mine. The table underneath all of that. The thing that makes it possible to sit down with people who love you honestly and let a meal be what it's supposed to be. I thought about the year before. The blue dress and the good china and the cranberry sauce that firmed up while I stood by the window watching for a car that was never going to come. The 3 place settings. The courier at the door. I thought about Nathan's 9 words sent at 4:17. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. I had moved through anger and out the other side of it somewhere around the time I sat on the farmhouse floor and cried until I was empty. What remained was something quieter and more permanent. A kind of settled clarity, the understanding that I had loved my son completely and correctly, and that he had made choices I could not be responsible for, and that these 2 things could both be true at the same time without either one canceling the other out. I would not set the table for him again. Not the way I had been, hopefully, compulsively, believing that if I just made it warm enough and good enough, he would remember what it meant to show up. That table was done. I had cleared it, but I would build other tables. I was already building them. The foundation, Ruth Patton finding her way back to herself over sweet potato casserole. Cooper on the living room floor, constructing something with the pure focused joy that only 8-year-olds and very satisfied adults possess. Babs in my kitchen with her apron and her cornbread and 19 years of reliable friendship. The empty chair with the glass of water and the knowledge of who it was for. You don't need blood to build a family, Earl had written in the last weeks of his journal. You need people who show up when they say they will. That's it. That's the whole thing. The rocking chair creaked steadily. The stars were cold and bright above the bare maple tree. From inside the house, I heard Babs laugh again. I reached into my cardigan pocket and found the pen I always kept there, a habit from years of making grocery lists and jotting things down before I forgot them. I didn't have paper, but I had my hand, and Earl always said that was what hands were for before notebooks were invented. I wrote on my palm, in small letters, zinnias, black-eyed Susans, yellow paint, the reminders I needed, the spring I was going to have. I sat on the porch for another hour after Babs left, rocking slowly, watching the quiet street, letting the cold do what cold is good at, making everything sharp and real and impossible to pretend otherwise. The year before, I had set the table for people who had already chosen another one. This year, I had stopped. I had taken down the careful place settings and put away the performance of hoping, and I had built something different. Not a substitute, not a consolation. Something actual, something chosen, something that had nothing to do with what I was missing and everything to do with what I had. A different table. My table. One where the cranberry sauce didn't have time to firm up because people were actually there to eat it. One where the chair at the head was mine. One where the empty chair beside me held the memory of a man who had spent 4 years building me a life I could stand in, who had loved me the way he loved the mountains, completely, and without any interest in changing them, and who had known, better than I did, that I would figure out what to do with it. He was right. He was, as he had been about most things, entirely right. I leaned back in the old rocking chair, Earl's chair, my chair, and looked up through the bare branches of the maple tree at the cold, clear sky, and I breathed. The stars did not move. The street was quiet. Inside my house, the lights were warm. I'm all right, Earl, I thought, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it completely. Last year, Dorothy Hargrove set the table for people who never planned to sit down. This year, she stopped. She stopped waiting for love to arrive from the direction she'd been watching, and she turned around and found it had been standing behind her all along, in a worn rocking chair, a brass key on a plain ring, 5 words on a note card. In the people who brought cornbread without being asked, who stayed until the dishes were done, who said I know and meant it, who built Lego bridges on the living room floor and asked no complicated questions. In a man who had watched her for 43 years and spent his last ones making sure she would still be standing. She is still standing. The table is full, and she built it herself.